many examples of drug traffickers the CIA gets involved with that way. I mean, it's, you know, the CIA is like sort of fleas on the dog, CIA and drugs. They just go together, it seems. And now drug traffickers, they go together. And I think a scenario like that is plausible, because I don't think, to sum up, the CIA could have really understood what the mass impact of LSD would be.
That's Martin Lee, and this is Alternative Radio. This edition of AR features Martin Lee on the CIA and LSD, acid dreams. During the Cold War in the early 1950s, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency experimented and developed LSD as a mind control espionage weapon. It launched a massive covert program in which countless innocent civilians were used as guinea pigs. Though the CIA was intent on keeping the drug for its own purposes, it could not prevent it from spreading into the popular culture, resulting in major social consequences. Martin Lee is an award-winning journalist and author. His classic book on the CIA and LSD is entitled Acid Dreams. He spoke in Menlo Park, California.
As you know, of course, the Summer of Love, that in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, that was a time when the whole psychedelic scene emerged with such intensity that it captured worldwide attention that year. And the drug experience, and LSD in particular, was certainly a central part of what was happening in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco during that period. I think a lot of people who were devotees of acid, as it was called, or is called, saw it, at least at that time, as somehow a ticket that would send everybody, gliding into the age of Aquarius. And these people, I doubt, had any inkling that the CIA and the U.S. military were heavily involved with the same drug, but for a very, very different purpose. And that really gets to the crux of the ironic nature of the LSD story, that one group of people in the 60s, or millions of people in fact, embraced the drug as a sacrament, as a mind-expanding drug, when 10, 15 years earlier, the CIA and the Army were investigating the same drug as an instrument of warfare, clandestine warfare, not as a mind-expanding drug, but as a mind-control drug, not as a sacrament, but as a weapon. And I think the LSD story is a story that abounds with all sorts of ironies, but that is the central irony of the story. So what I'm going to do in this discussion is talk about how the CIA and the Army got into experimenting with LSD and other drugs, what they were looking for when they first got their hands on LSD, what happened when they began to experiment with it, what happened when they started taking it themselves, the CIA agents, the people in the Army, how they eventually used it in an operational context, both as a chemical warfare weapon, at least that's what the Army did, and as a cloak and dagger weapon as the CIA used it. So as anyone who knows about LSD, knows the story, how it begins, that's a fairly familiar one, with the chemist Dr. Albert Hofmann, who was working in the Swiss pharmaceutical firm Sandoz when he developed LSD-25. It was the 25th variation of a molecule or a compound he was working on, so he called it LSD-25. That was in 1938. Basically, it just sat on the shelf. He didn't really know what he had created. And then 5 years later, he accidentally absorbed some of the drug through his fingertips, and he had the first LSD trip that anyone has ever taken. And it was a very powerful experience. This was in April 1943, and he ended up writing about it. And at that time, World War II was going on. And the CIA's wartime predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, was already involved in its own drug testing program. They were looking for a truth serum, a truth drug they can use in an interrogation context to get information from enemies, from suspected double agents, from what have you. Anybody they wanted to get information from who wouldn't willingly give that information. That's why the OSS was trying to develop a truth drug. And they tested a whole bunch of different drugs, starting in 1942. And the one, interestingly enough, that they decided was the most suitable for loosening a person's tongue and getting information against their will was, of all things, marijuana. And they developed an extract of marijuana which they would inject in a cigarette, sort of like a gooey substance. They put it in a tobacco cigarette, or they put it in food, or they put in different things to get it into a person's system. and then this would relax a person or whatever, get them to talk. This is what the OSS concluded, that marijuana was the best known truth substance, truth drug, available at the time. And this was from a once classified U.S. intelligence memorandum, an OSS report, and I read through about 20,000 pages of these things pertaining to the drug programs of the CIA and the Army and other military agencies. And this is how what they call TD, which is a rather transparent sort of code name for truth drug, this is how they described marijuana back in the World War II period. And I'm quoting now, TD appears to relax all inhibitions and to deaden the areas of the brain which govern an individual's discretion and caution. It accentuates the senses and makes manifest any strong characteristics of the individual. Sexual inhibitions are lowered, and the sense of humor is accentuated to the point where any statement or situation can become extremely funny to the subject. On the other hand, a person's unpleasant characteristics may also be heightened. It may be stated that, generally speaking, the reaction will be one of great loquacity and hilarity. I think that's actually a rather accurate description of the marijuana experience. What was interesting, one of the people who sat on the committee that oversaw these OSS experiments in which they developed or came to the conclusion that marijuana was a truth drug was the head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, Harry Anslinger, who was going around promoting the reefer madness idea that you smoke a joint, you'll kill your brother. And it's a very different image of what marijuana does to you than what secretly Anslinger knew that the OSS had concluded, that it's playful, that makes you laugh, it lowers your inhibitions, this kind of thing. Eventually, the OSS realized that marijuana really wasn't the perfect truth serum by any means, and they concluded in one of their memos at the end of the war when they were summing up the program, I'm quoting again, this is about TD, the drug defies all but the most expert and searching analysis and for all practical purposes can be considered beyond analysis. That's what they had to say about marijuana. Now, after World War II, the CIA picked up where the OSS had left off, and they continued this search for the perfect truth drug. And the CIA basically looked at any interrogation in which a drug was employed to get information from somebody. They referred to that as a special interrogation or an unorthodox interrogation. That meant any interrogation where anything was utilized to assist the interrogation above and beyond just verbal manipulation. That was a special interrogation. And during the late 40s, the CIA developed two special interrogation techniques that they were using fairly frequently in interrogations. One involved administering to a person a kind of a down or a soporific, something to kind of lull them, if not to sleep, but just sort of loosen them up. And then the CIA would try to have that person hypnotized in that condition. Narco-hypnosis was the first example or first kind of special interrogation technique. And the other special interrogation technique, when that didn't work, was to give a person a barbiturate, literally to hook a person up with two IVs, one in either arm. One would have a barbiturate, and they'd flip the switch, the barbiturate would go into the system, the person would fall asleep. And then they'd have in the other ID an amphetamine, an upper, when they'd switch that on, to bring the person out from the unconscious state. And they wanted to get the person just at the point where they were just coming to, just in that groggy condition, coming out of unconsciousness, just beginning to be wakeful, but not really wakeful, in this, what they call the twilight zone or talking zone, this sort of semi-conscious state. Try to keep a person in this condition by sort of, administering these drugs in either arm. So this condition was deemed optimum as far as the CIA was concerned, to getting a person to talk and to say things that they might not otherwise say if they were, being interrogated. Now, as you can imagine, it was a sort of rather crude technique. It was difficult to regulate the exact flow of the drugs, and they were getting some positive results as far as they was concerned from both of these special interrogation techniques, but neither of them provided surefire results. And because of that, the CIA kept looking, again, for that perfect truth serum. It became an obsession for them. And in 1951, or at least that's the earliest I was able to identify it, the CIA began to experiment with LSD as a part of what was called Project Artichoke. That was the code name for the program, and that was being run by a unit within the CIA called the Office of Security, or at that time it was the Inspection and Security Staff. It became the Office of Security, the unit within the CIA responsible for the security of various CIA installations and buildings. And one thing they had to was protect against infiltration. That was part of their early mandate, so they were looking at different interrogation techniques for this purpose, and they got their hands on LSD. Now, LSD had first come to the United States in 1949. It was brought over from Switzerland, where Sandoz was making the drug available to scientists and researchers who were studying how the mind works and so forth. And a fellow named Dr. Max Rinkel, who is based in Boston, associated with Harvard University, he brought the drug over for the first time to the United States in 1949. And he ended up being employed by the CIA, at least indirectly. He was funded by the CIA through different conduits to do LSD research for them, but that was still a few years later now. So it's in 1951, the CIA begins to experiment with LSD. And initially they think, and they really get blown away by this, and they think, God, this can really be the drug they were looking for. It seems to have very promising results for them. They start referring to it as the truth drug they were looking for. And it seems to not only make people sort of spill the beans, but they have a hard time remembering exactly what happened while they're under the influence of the drug, so they thought, well, that's perfect. Get them to spill the beans and not even remember they spilled the beans. This is more than they could have ever hoped for. And the memorandum during this period, 1951-52, within the Office of Security is like, we finally found it. We've got the holy grail of the cloak and dagger trade. This is going to unlock the human mind, and we're going to get the information we want almost at will. And they had a rather naive view of it, but they were very, very excited about LSD. But when more reports started coming in, during this first year of research now, they began to get some conflicting signals and contradictory reports. Some reports indicated that LSD seemed to make people so confused that they were getting garbled information from people. It wasn't accurate. And this gave rise to the idea, well, if it's not a truth serum, or maybe it's sort of like a lie serum. Maybe if you gave it to an enemy, if you gave it to your own agents to have, instead of like a suicide pill, they would have an LSD pill with them, and they're going overseas on a mission. They get caught by the enemy. The Soviets are interrogating the CIA agent. If they could somehow pop this LSD pill without the Soviet, they'd be guaranteed to give nonsensical information. It would almost, that's how they were beginning to talk about it. At the same time, some are saying, this is the truth drug. Others are saying, no, this is this interesting kind of lie serum. And it underscores just how confused they were about LSD. But something interesting happened. Every drug that became later popular on the street in the 1960s, from heroin, cocaine, mescaline, magic mushrooms, all these things the CIA and the Army were looking at 10 years early very intensely. All of them, bar none, became popular later as street drugs. Usually what happened is the CIA tests the drug, they assess its implications in terms of interrogation, its usefulness. If it's useful, they use it. If not, they put it on the shelf, they go on to something else. With LSD, it didn't happen that way. They start testing it, they think it's useful, then they realize it's not really quite the way they wanted it to be as a truth drug, but instead of putting it on the shelf and moving on, they sort of did a double take. Because here was a drug they thought was so powerful, it was the most powerful mind drug known to science at the time, odorless, colorless, tasteless, meaning, unlike some drugs, if you put it in a person's drink and it's a bitter flavor, when you're drinking, something's going on. LSD, no one could know that when you have no way of knowing when someone was putting it in your system against your will. And it seemed to harbor some awesome potential for cloak and dagger purposes, but they didn't understand what it was, really. So rather than just sort of throwing it in the garbage, they said, okay, if it's not a truth drug, then what is it and how can we use it? And they embarked on a very intensive period of examination with the drug, and it took two forms. There was out-of-house studies, contract studies, where they would fund scientists, psychiatrists, who were already themselves beginning to work with LSD and mescaline and other hallucinogenic drugs. The CIA stepped in at a very early phase when only a relatively small number of scientists were doing this, and they began to fund their research. Sometimes the people who were getting the funding didn't even know it was coming from the CIA, because the CIA had a lot of questions that had more or less legitimate medical purposes to these questions. And was there an antidote for LSD? They wanted to know. Could you kill someone with it? Could you overdose? It turns out you cannot physically overdose from LSD, although you can psychologically overdose. You cannot. It doesn't physically kill you. But they have these sorts of very fundamental. What happens if you mix it with another drug? What happens when you do this and that? Could you combine it with other mind control techniques like hypnosis and so forth? So they funded these outside scientists to look into these sorts of questions, which are more or less legitimate questions from the point of view of medical science. At the same time, the CIA was also pursuing its own studies in-house. And I want to talk about both of these. In terms of the out-of-house, the contract studies, some of it got into some pretty dicey areas. For example, the CIA and the U.S. Army were financing the work of Dr. Paul Hoke, who was the head of the New York State Psychiatric Institute in New York City. And he, very early on, was doing things like giving people LSD and mescaline, sometimes through not just oral administration, but injecting LSD straight into the spinal cord. He was doing things like giving people LSD and then applying electroshock therapy while they're under the influence of LSD, which is, it's a horrible thing to think of. But the goriest of all, what he was doing was giving people LSD, lobotomizing them, sometimes where they're still under the influence of LSD or mescaline, and then after the operation, a week or two later, give them the psychedelic or the hallucinogenic drug again to compare the effects before or after. And all these things are being described in the reports that this Dr. Hoke is writing up, and he's getting funded by the CIA and the Army, and I think he was witting of where it was coming from. In addition to some of the work that Hoke was doing, the CIA and the Army were also funding a fellow named Dr. Heath, Edward Heath in St. Louis, in New Orleans. When the college down there, he was doing things like giving people LSD while they have electrodes implanted into their brain and then stimulating the electrodes to see what kind of sensations or experiences a person would have. Another example, just sort of some of the gore stories here from the CIA documents, was some of the work that was going on at Lexington Narcotics Hospital during the 1950s. This is in Lexington, Kentucky, and ostensibly it's a place where heroin addicts would go when they wanted to shake their habit. They wanted to try to get off the drug. They would check into Lexington, into the addiction research center there, and detox and so forth and so on. But the word got out on the street that if you wanted to get heroin, if the supply was short on the street and you were having a hard time scoring, you could volunteer, check into Lexington, and offer yourself as a guinea pig for these wacky drug experiments that were going on there, where people were being paid for their participation, junkies, in heroin, in morphine, if they would allow themselves to be experimented upon with, well, they didn't know what the drugs really were, but they would turn out to be LSD and psilocybin being the extract of the magic mushroom, the synthetic extract. And this was going on. In fact, William Burroughs, the novelist, wrote Naked Lunch, who died recently, great novelist and amazing writer. He himself checked into Lexington Narcotics Hospital. At one point, he was a heroin addict, and so he told me about these things directly. So one of the things they were doing at Lexington, these experiments were being run by Dr. Harris Isbell, who was a Whitting recipient of CIA funds, and later a big muckety-muck within the FDA and the NIMH and NIH, National Institute of Mental Health and National Institute of Health in the Washington area, sort of the government's medical bureaucracy. He was giving people LSD sometimes for 70 days straight, and increasing the doses massively, because with LSD, the way it works is a very high threshold tolerance level, so that if a person takes it one day, you have to give them like twice the dose the next day for them to have an experience, because ordinarily it would be very difficult to have an experience again with the same dose. It just wouldn't work, because that's the way the drug works. So they were giving people massive doses for weeks on end, and invariably these were African American guinea pigs who were being used in these experiments. So while all this is going on, that's just an example of some of the fine scientific work that the CIA was funding. The CIA is also experimenting, in-house, not going to quote-unquote reputable scientists, but experimenting on themselves, in fact, because they had the sense, the intuition, that if they were going to ever figure out how to use this drug in a cloak and dagger context, if it was going to be used operationally, most likely it would be used in a way that where a person who was getting it, being given the drug, would not realize. It would be sort of a surprise, a surreptitious administration. So given the fact the CIA realized that this was the direction they were going to be moving in, they had a sort of step-by-step series of tests where they got to the point where they started first experimenting on each other, and then they eventually started giving it to unwitting American citizens, just randomly, who were being targeted. And this is how it worked. The unit within the CIA, incidentally, that was taking the lead now by 1953 was not the Office of Security. It was sort of a rival unit within the CIA called the Technical Services Staff. And they ran what was called the MK Ultra program, which was the main drug and mind control experiment research program that the CIA pursued during the Cold War. Within MK Ultra, there was 149 different sub-projects within this MK Ultra project. And the Technical Services Staff sort of administered this and ran this. Now, as the name implies, what their role within the CIA, and it was only like a half a dozen people in the early going who was part of this unit, and it grew to about a dozen people, by the end of the 1950s. They would supply technical support for CIA operations in the field. If the CIA needed, a poison pen or something that writes with invisible, sort of spy gadgets, the technical service staff would come up with these things, create them. Your James Bond type of scenarios, right? Or maybe it was more like Get Smart, I don't know. But, and so one of the areas they were very interested in was LSD. And they plunged into this whole hog, and eventually they became the principal unit within the CIA looking into this. There was about 4 or 5 other units within the CIA as well that was interested in LSD, but Technical Services took the lead. And what they did was, first they decided among themselves, half a dozen or so people, they were going to give it to each other and all try the drug, and they did. And they decided among themselves that they would spring it on each other without forewarning. When they did that, again, in the early phases, as soon as the person, drank their morning coffee at the CIA, then his buddy would say, oh, by the way, you got it, so prepare to take the day off. You're going to have an LSD experience. And then, the next phase was they slip it into the coffee, but they didn't tell someone, within their own unit now that they had gotten it. And then they started doing something similar for other people within the CIA outside. It grew from there till they got to the point where they began to target unwitting American citizens and testing on them. The person who oversaw these experiments where unwitting Americans were being targeted on an experimental basis was a high-ranking Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent named George Hunter White. And he was sort of on loan or working kind of double duty for the narcs on the one hand and for the CIA. By day, he was going around busting drug dealers. At night, he was involved in an operation called Midnight Climax, wherein drug-addicted prostitutes that White employed would lure customers, unlucky customers, it turned out, to a CIA safe house in New York City initially, and then in the San Francisco Bay Area there was a couple as well. And this safe house would be decorated as a bordello. It's a whorehouse, essentially. And White would sit behind the mirrors that couldn't be seen on the other side and would watch what was going on, two-way mirrors. And he'd watch as these prostitutes would slip LSD into the drinks of their customers, and then they would do their thing, and then sometimes people, once the drug took effect, which usually takes about 45 minutes or an hour, some of them got so scared that they just ran out into the night and no one ever knew what happened with these people. Others stayed and whatnot, and sometimes they were filmed, and basically White was recording the information. He'd take notes. He referred to the drug, incidentally, as Stormy was his code name, which is sort of indicative of the type of experiences people were having, sort of rough trips, as it were. And he would give this information to his colleagues at the CIA in the Technical Services staff. So this was Midnight Climax. At the same time this was going on, people in Technical Services were continuing the in-house experimentation. And it got to the point, because of the rivalry, some of the other units in the CIA who were working with LSD kind of got jealous that Technical Services was getting more of the money, particularly the Office of Security, the first one that got in there. So the Office of Security assigned someone to spy on Technical Services and find out everything they were doing with LSD. And to their chagrin, they discovered that the Technical Services staff was planning to put LSD in the punch served at the annual CIA Christmas office party in 1954. And there was actually a document to this effect describing this and recommending how this not happen. But it underscores just sort of how crazy things were getting down at CIA headquarters, and it was that loose. And a lot of CIA agents were taking LSD, whether volunteering or not. At one point, what's interesting about this Christmas caper, it was 10 years later that Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters in this area in California started holding their electric Kool-Aid acid test, where they were putting LSD in the punch and then they're having these wild acid rock parties. And again, it's one of those ironies that the CIA was really the first to do this with electrifying the punch, and then later on it became sort of a cause célèbre almost, for the for the nascent counterculture in the 60s. The CIA had an idea that it might be useful for their own agents who they were sending in the field operationally into dangerous missions if they were made familiar with the LSD experience before they were sent on a mission. Because, again, if they were captured and it turned out that the Communist Chinese or the North Koreans or the Russians or whoever might be the enemy in this case dosed their agent with LSD to interrogate them, if their agent was already familiar with the effects of the drug, and they called such agents enlightened operatives. That's how the CIA memorandum refers to them, which would have sure tickled Timothy Leary's fancy to call such people who had taken LSD in the CIA as enlightened. The idea was that if they were familiar with the experience, they'd be less likely to be manipulated if they were given the drug surreptitiously by the Soviets, or they would realize at least that it was a temporary experience that lasts 10 or 12 hours and it didn't last forever, and they could hold their own, they could resist an interrogator. And there was some discussion of using LSD in this way, almost like a mind control vaccine, as it were. And what happened, it was a very interesting series of memos that I read through, in the early 50s still now, where something called the Project Committee, wherein representatives from each of the units within the CIA involved with LSD, the medical office sent somebody, counterintelligence sent somebody, Office of Scientific Intelligence, Office of Security, Technical Service, so on. They all got together where they would sort of compare notes, or at least some things they would say, and share some of their information. And at one point, the representative from the CIA's medical office suggests that LSD be given to all male trainee volunteers. And then someone else suggests, well, why just all male trainee volunteers? Why not all components of the agency should have this available to them? And then the project committee, the memo says, verbally concurred in this recommendation. So it seems that a lot of CIA agents were experimenting with LSD or experiencing LSD in the early and mid-1950s. And the obvious question is, well, what did this do to them? I mean, it obviously didn't make them grow long hair and put on love beads and sandals and go, marching down Haight Street. We're talking 10 years early anyway. But, what did it do to them? And it seems that it did something very interesting, because as I looked at the, documents, I saw, well, something very astounding happens. In the early going, the whole focus is on speech inducing, interrogation, getting information, using drugs almost solely for that purpose. And then they encounter LSD, and they go through this intense turmoil for about 18 months. All of a sudden, they're talking about using drugs for 50 different things. It's almost as if LSD catalyzed their spy minds, and sort of made them think more creatively about what they could do with drugs. So I'll cite as an example one of the documents that I accessed through the Freedom of Information Act. This was from May 5th, 1955, and this is an MK Ultra document, and it's a document that refers to subproject 35, again, the 35th of the subprojects of the 149, and this particular research was conducted at the Georgetown University Medical Facility in Washington, D.C. And what it lists is 17 different materials or kinds of substances they were looking for to do these 17 different things. Again, speech inducing is just one thing now among many. And I can't read all 17, but I'll just read a few to give you a sense of sort of the directions they were going. The first is substances which will promote illogical thinking and impulsiveness to the point where the recipient would be discredited in public. Indeed, LSD was eventually used that way operationally. Second is substances which increase the efficiency of mentation and perception, meaning make people smarter or more alert. Third, materials which will prevent or counteract the intoxicating effect of alcohol. And the fourth is one that will promote or exaggerate the intoxicating effect of alcohol. And I'm just skipping randomly now. Materials which will render the induction of hypnosis easier or otherwise enhance its usefulness. Materials and physical methods which will produce amnesia for events preceding and during their use. Methods of producing shock and confusion over extended periods of time and capable of surreptitious use. Substances which will reduce physical disablement such as paralysis of the legs, acute anemia, etc. Substance, and this is my favorite actually, substances which will produce pure euphoria with no subsequent letdown. It goes on. Incidentally, if anyone knows of that substance, if you want to come up and talk to me afterwards, I'd be happy to share some of the research there. But again, it shows how the CIA is sort of in a rut and one-track way of thinking about drugs, and they encounter LSD, and all of a sudden it's like all these different things, and I just scratched the surface there, and this is just, remember now, that was one document pertaining to one sub-project of one overall program of which there were several programs, so it gives you a sense of how extensive this research. Many millions of dollars were expended into this research, and it wasn't just LSD, and it wasn't just drugs, but all kinds of different behavior control and mind control techniques were studied by the CIA. I mean, hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, anything that relates to controlling human behavior and modifying the mind. The CIA was looking at it very, very intensely. But now, getting back to LSD, the CIA eventually did come up with certain operational uses for LSD. And one of those I just alluded to, and that was this idea that it can be used as a discrediting agent. If they can find a way to slip LSD into a system of a politician in a third world country, let's say, before they're about to give a speech, and then during the speech of someone who gave long speeches like Fidel Castro in Cuba, who was targeted in this way, but the CIA never managed to make it work. During the middle, the theory was during the middle of the speech, the drug's effect would start to come on, and the person would begin to babble in a ridiculous way and would make a fool of himself or herself in front of the followers, and would therefore be discredited. That's the idea of the discrediting agent. And LSD was used in this way operationally. I did read documents which had the names blacked out of who they were targeting, but it's clear that there were some politicians in Africa that the CIA was targeting this way. They know that they wanted to target Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, but they were not able to. But some they were successful. There was another way the CIA thought about using LSD, and that was as a psychological assessment agent. And I don't know if they ever actually did this, but the idea was that, again, they were concerned about if a person was being sent overseas on a mission, how easy it would be to break them or crack them if they were captured by the enemy. And it seemed that with LSD, it produced a lot of anxiety in people. That's what they seemed to encounter at the CIA. And the question was, well, if you gave LSD to a person, they can handle it well. That means they can handle stressful situations. That made them better suited to go out on these missions. But the other way that they eventually did use it operationally, CIA now and LSD, was as an interrogation agent, but wasn't as the classical truth theorem kind of scenario where you give a person a drug and then sort of automatically they give you the information. It was different. What they found was that if they gave a person LSD without forewarning and the drug began to take effect, oftentimes the person wouldn't even know that they were having these bizarre hallucinations and so forth because of a drug. All they know, they're in this situation, they're being kept in isolation, and all of a sudden they're starting to go wacky, and then the CIA interrogators, having failed to get information from them in the past, will say, we will keep you in this crazy, flipped out state forever unless you tell us what we want to know. And the person doesn't realize that they're under the influence of LSD. They've never heard of the drug. It's not even, hardly anybody has heard of the drug now in their early mid-50s. And it was really like a psychological third-degree tactic, an instrument of torture. And they found this was a successful way, oftentimes, to get people to give information. Basically use this as an instrument of torture. And in a similar way, the U.S. Army used LSD as an interrogation agent. And they used it in Vietnam during the Vietnam War to interrogate Viet Cong, quote unquote. And it's clearly spelled out in documents that it was used in this way. But the U.S. Army also had another idea of what to do with LSD. And this was even more grandiose than the CIA. And that is if they came up with this idea that if they could spray LSD as an aerosol, over a city, which was occupied by enemy troops, it would sort of make everybody in the city, the occupiers and the occupied, sort of flip out or go crazy for like half a day, and at that point, the U.S. Army can move in and take over the city, dislodge the enemy with practically no resistance at all, because the enemy would be incapable of fighting, because in fact this is what the Army found when they gave their own soldiers in many different places around the country, Fort McClellan, Fort Benning, several places. They gave U.S. soldiers LSD and asked them to perform military drills, and found they couldn't really march straight, and everything was going really chaotic. In fact, I mean you can imagine how it was. And they concluded that this is potentially a tremendous agent tremendously useful agent as an offensive weapon, as a psychochemical warfare, what they call it, agent. They call it madness gas. Something that can knock people out or disable them or temporarily incapacitate them, but it wasn't lethal, so it wouldn't kill them. And this was deemed to have certain advantages in particular situations, like if you had to rescue hostages or the scenario I just laid out with the city being occupied. The problem was that the Army never can get it to work as an aerosol spray. They never found a way to disseminate LSD as an aerosol. And that proved to be a stumbling block, but it gave the Army the idea to pursue the scenario. So once again, LSD acted as a catalyst. And the Army did develop drugs, super hallucinogens, more powerful than LSD, that they were able to disseminate in aerosol form. And the one particular drug that they used in this way was called BZ. And it was a very powerful drug, whereas LSD lasts for about 12 hours or so. BZ on the whole generally lasts about 3 days, with side effects up to 6 weeks. Unlike LSD, with BZ not only do you have visual hallucinations, but auditory hallucinations. You see things that aren't there, you don't see things that are there. And again, this is different from LSD, where even though things are different and their hallucinations can be very vivid, still it's not like you're out of touch. You know if there's a tree, there's a tree. It might look different than ordinarily, but it's not like you're not seeing a tree that's there or seeing a tree that isn't. So it's even more bizarre type of hallucinogen, this BZ. And the Army developed it into one of its 7 standardized chemical warfare agents, and by standardized, I mean it went through all the preclinical and clinical testing, and then it was actually turned into weapons so that they can be, with BZ in the case they made hand grenades, cluster bombs, and different ways of disseminating BZ. And they actually used BZ on a limited basis in Vietnam to sort of blast BZ into tunnels where the enemy was hiding out and so forth and so on. The problem with BZ in wartime situation, it's difficult if you're using it in an open air context to control which way the wind blows. And it also turns out, if you spray it and you're trying to get the enemy and then the wind shifts, you're going to get your own people. And that limited its usefulness. Also, with BZ, it was lethal when the dosage level reached a certain point. It could actually kill somebody, which also limited its usefulness as a non-lethal incapacitant. But they did develop it into one of their 7 standardized chemical warfare agents, along with the mustard gas and the choking gas and the nerve agents and so forth and so on. So that's what the Army was doing with hallucinogens. At the same time, the CIA and the Army were experimenting with these drugs, particularly during the 50s now, in the early going. You did have, as I referred to earlier, a handful of scientists and psychologists and psychiatrists who were also getting interested in these substances. And initially, the research was focused on using LSD to study how the mind works, to understand brain processes, brain chemical processes. The idea being, or at least the theory in the early going, was that if you give a normal person LSD, he or she will become temporarily insane until the drug wore off. So it was seen as something potentially, or of great potential usefulness for studying mental illness, schizophrenia. Because you can almost, like in a lab setting, give it to a person, then they become schizophrenic, and then the drug wears off and they're back to normal. And they became very interested in this, several scientists. At the same time, there's sort of another tangent some researchers went off on. It didn't stay within what was called the psychotomimetic, madness mimicking paradigm. Some researchers started to look at the drug in a different way, and it was largely due, ironically, to a former, well, I shouldn't even say former, he was an intelligence operative named Captain Al Hubbard, a very colorful spook, a U.S. spy, who was the first person to come along and say, no, you don't use LSD to study schizophrenia, you use LSD to create visionary experiences, to create religious experiences, to help heal people, not to study what, sickness, but to actually overcome it. And just to sketch out his story in a thumbnail sketch, because he was one of the most interesting characters I came across. I had, I would say, the privilege of meeting him shortly before he died when I was researching acid dreams. He really was the first Johnny Appleseed of LSD 10 years before Leary. Hubbard, during World War II, was sort of like an Oliver North type of character, in that he was involved in a technically illegal operation moving weapons, getting weapons from the United States to Britain, in this case, during World War II, at a time when the United States was officially neutral and was not supposed to be involved with any of the warring parties. Hubbard oversaw an operation while he was based in Vancouver where they would take apart planes and ships and move the stuff across the border and then send it from Canada to Britain. So it made it look like it was coming to Canada. So in that sense, I would call him sort of like an Oliver North, because that's what Oliver North was doing with the Nicaraguan Contras in the 1980s, getting weapons to them illegally when Congress didn't allow it. And what happens is after the war, President Truman gives Hubbard and his men a special citation for having done all this. At this point, Hubbard is already a very wealthy man from his exploits as a uranium entrepreneur. And in 1951, the same year the CIA begins to experiment with LSD, he is introduced to LSD on the psychiatrist's couch through a doctor in Great Britain, and he claims to witness during his first LSD trip his parents making love, the sperm meeting the egg, and his own conception he claims to witness. And then needless to say, he thought this was amazing, and he becomes a proselytizer. And since he was very wealthy from his uranium business, and he could fly his own plane, he began to buy up LSD and other drugs and distribute it to people, just basically give it to anyone who was interested, mainly doctors and scientists who wanted to explore the different side of LSD, not the mind control side, but the mind expanding side. Because this is really what Hubbard was into, and it's kind of ironic given his roots, having worked with the OSS, and still, during this period, he wasn't working with the CIA, but he was had a relation with various intelligence agencies and in the U.S. and military companies who were doing contract research for the U.S. government and so forth. He claims to have known J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, personally. He tried to turn Hoover on, but Hoover wouldn't go for it. But one of the people that Hubbard did give LSD to, I should say two of them, one of them was Aldous Huxley, the great novelist, wrote Brave New World, and he wrote some of the most impressive descriptions of the hallucinogenic drug experience, The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell. Hubbard was the first one to give him LSD, and Hubbard also gave LSD to a good friend of Huxley's, a man named Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was a researcher in Canada, a psychiatrist, and he ended up coining the word psychedelic. Because what Hubbard and Huxley and Osmond felt was that the description of LSD as a psychotomimetic, madness-miming agent was very narrow, and it didn't encompass or didn't adequately describe what the drug was. So Osmond came up with the phrase psychedelic. And that actually is a rather neutral term. Again, this is many years before the phrase psychedelic became popular among, countercultural lingo. But literally translated, it means mind manifesting, to make manifest psychedelic what is in the mind, or to make what is unconscious conscious, or to bring things to the surface of the mind. And that notion of making manifest what's in the mind sort of lent itself very well to therapy, because that's what therapy is all about, making the unconscious conscious, coming to terms with complexes or repressed material. But with normal therapy, it takes a long time to do this on the psychiatric couch. And with LSD, it was like, you give a person the drug, if you're a therapist, and it seems like in one day, you'd have a more insightful experience if it was managed well than it would for years of therapy. This is what doctors seem to be finding, and they became very excited about the drug in this context as a therapy, adjunct to therapy. And there was more than 1,000 scientific papers written on this. It was looked upon very seriously in this way. It was seen as having a possible benefit for alcoholics and for many different contexts in terms of therapeutic mode of use. In fact, it became all the rage at one point in the late 50s in Hollywood, where people like Cary Grant and Jack Nicholson and many different actors and actresses were starting to take it and began to get some publicity in this way. It was still, at a time when LSD had none of the negative baggage associated with it that came when Timothy Leary started to use the drug and experiment with it in the 1960s. So whereas the psychiatrists in the 50s saw it as something that you can use to heal the mind, Leary came along and says, no, you can use it to heal society, cure-all for a sick society. He sort of projected its possibilities on a mass social scale. And, this is now we're getting into territory probably more familiar with. He became, obviously, as we know, the Pied Piper of LSD, and he through his efforts, it became widely publicized. He attracted a lot of media attention, and it also generated a rather significant backlash, where as a result of some of his escapades, and just because that seemed to be the tenor of the time, there was a backlash, particularly in the media, where all sorts of negative things were being said about LSD by establishmentarian, or I should say, by guardians of the establishment. And at the time when this propaganda barrage was being churned out, and the scare stories were going around, claiming that it would, a woman who got pregnant, if she had taken LSD any time in her life, would give birth to like an octopus or something, And at the same time, stories like this were going around. Leary was saying, you know, one dose and you see God, and it was like this very polarized, exaggerated discussion in the media about what LSD was, and it made people very interested and curious, obviously, and ended up generating greater usage. In terms of the 1960s, in terms of understanding the impact of LSD and what it, what it did in terms of the student movements and the counterculture and the New Left and the overall rebellion that happened in the 1960s. This is an interesting area that I get into in Acid Dreams and look at very carefully. About the second half of the book, you know, year by year, looks at sort of traces what happens with the drug. But, you know, sort of to bring it home in a nutshell, you know, as a historian, I think LSD is very useful because if you accept the definition, as I do, as the psychiatrist is using it for a therapeutic agent, and basically their definition of LSD was that it was a non-specific amplifier of psychic processes. Meaning without fear or favor, it would amplify what was in the mind, conscious or unconscious, and that might be scary or difficult things, or it might be very pleasant or pleasurable things. Without fear or favor, it would sort of bring this up in a non-specific way. And I thought that that's a pretty good definition. The only limitation is that, you know, what's going on in one's psyche is not unconnected from what's going on in the larger social landscape. The psychic fabric and the social fabric intersect. So if you are amplifying psychic processes, you're also amplifying social processes. And if what LSD does then in concentrated areas of use is amplify social processes as well, in a non-specific way, as a historian, it's a sort of a useful tool. You can sort of run it over like, you know, almost like a magnifying glass. It becomes, where is it being used? Then what is it amplifying in these areas or in this period? So I start, you know, from 1965 in February, when the first large-scale amount of LSD was coming out on the street, began to be used as a street drug. It was a little bit around before then, but it was in February of '65. It's a crucial moment because that's when the Vietnam War starts in a big way for the United States. The bombing campaign begins. So it happens just at the same time the LSD starts sort of flooding certain avant-garde communities or student communities, Haight-Ashbury, Berkeley, Madison, Ann Arbor, New York City, and so forth. The obvious places first began being used in a significant way among students and young people and others who were all in areas where there was also a lot of political activism. So what my thesis was, and what it should mean, is that LSD will sort of rev things up and amplify sort of whatever the constellation of historical and social forces is at that moment, which in 1965 was a very optimistic time for people involved in that movement. The civil rights movement had gained a lot of headway, had achieved some success. You had, you know, this vibrant Bohemian scene. You have the anti-war movement really picking up steam in response to what was happening in Vietnam. And basically it was a very optimistic moment among people who felt, you know, that if they put their feet down in history, they could change history, they could change the world. And that was, we can look back on it and say, well, maybe people were naive to some degree. But indeed, that was the feeling of the moment. And the general sense of it is that LSD is sort of amplifying that in a general sense. And of course, things change very quickly in the 60s, and what happens in 1965 and what's going on is rather different from what's happening at the end of the decade, 1969. 1970, what was the Beatles song? Take a sad song and make it better. Well, then LSD is going to be amplifying that sad song. And that the sense of things going, you know, coming apart, and this kind of revolutionary craziness of like the Weather Underground, or, you know, the real extreme militancy that had really no connection with reality, that we're going to pick up the gun and the state will fall, and this kind of crazy ideas. Well, the Weather Underground were heavily into LSD during this period when they were going underground, you know. They were. And, you know, again, it magnifies not just for them, but in an overall sense, it's going to magnify a much more difficult moment where things are unraveling, the movement's coming unglued, the CIA, the FBI are sort of in there stoking up dissent and tensions within various factions, and there's the COINTEL program targeting the New Left, the Black Power movement, so forth and so on, to destroy these movements. And you have widespread use of LSD, and it's going to just amplify this, what we might call a bummer. You know. And the question is, to the extent that LSD amplifies the bummer, is that something that the CIA would have a role in terms of vis-a-vis LSD? That's an obvious question one can ask himself. Was the CIA somehow behind this? After all, they were into the drug early on. What do they make of what was going on in the 60s? And the more specific question is, not only could they anticipate what the impact of LSD was in terms of the mass usage, But is there any evidence linking CIA-connected personnel to the drug trade? And I think a certain similar kind of scenario is seen with the Nicaraguan Contras, and in fact, there's long, many, many different precedents for this. Again, it's something instructive here. It's not the idea. I mean, if someone's suggesting that the CIA sat around, the top people saying, well, how can we get drugs into the ghetto in the United States? Well, let's support the Contras because they'll bring cocaine in and so forth. That didn't happen. What happened is the CIA has a particular objective to support a clandestine army or a so-called clandestine army to achieve a certain foreign policy objective, and it so happens that these people are also raising money and they're involved through the drug trade, and the CIA knows this, and that's just one of the things. They know what the impact of this will be back in the United States will be, but that's not why they do it. They do it because they want to have a certain impact in Central American politics, and the other thing is sort of like collateral damage, if you will, which they know about and which they're in part responsible for. But it's different from saying the CIA thought it all up and planned to do it that way, which is sort of silly, and it's an easy straw man for people in the press to knock down. I don't think the CIA would have ever schemed up an idea of dumping lots of LSD out on the street, A, because I don't think they saw it as something that you can control the effects from very easily. They realized it was very difficult to control the effects in the field, and that's limited their use of it in an operational context. The CIA, it's like sort of fleas on the dog. CIA and drugs. They just go together, it seems. And now drug traffickers, they go together. And I think a scenario like that is plausible because I don't think, to sum up, the CIA could have really understood what the mass impact of LSD would be. They, in the early going, were trying to understand what its impact would be. They were commissioning, in the 1960s now, once like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, the drug got out of the laboratory and becomes this massively used, I think it would have shocked the CIA. A drug that they thought was like a threat to national security, was a weapon people would willingly take, was something that I don't think would sort of square with their mentality, or their understanding about the drug. But lo and behold, here it is, it's all happening. So they started commissioning these studies at think tanks such as the RAND Corporation, SRI, Stanford Research Institute, Hudson Institute. All of these think tanks were looking at the impact of LSD on the New Left, on the counterculture, what the mass use would, the impact of the massive use would be. And they were asking questions, for example, the RAND Corporation was asking questions like, if you gave LSD to a person who was politically engaged and active, whether on the right or the left, would it make them drop out of politics? But see, to me, that shows they don't understand what the drug does. It really betrays a lack of understanding. But those are the kind of things they were interested in. But they don't get it, Because again, look at the Weather Underground. They went totally nuts in their politics. The more they were taking LSD, the more crazy they were getting with their politics. Didn't make them drop out of politics, it made them more deeper in, if anything. And again, if it's a non-specific amplifier, more likely than not, if you're politically engaged and you took LSD, you'd stay politically engaged. Maybe you'd have a little bit of a different take or a little more colorful way of demonstrating or something. But it wouldn't change you radically in that sense, unless there was something in you that was already going in that direction. And I think in the end, what the CIA, the mistake they made in terms of LSD was something very similar to what a lot of people in the 1960s did with respect to LSD. They all made the same mistake. They all got very excited about the drug, whether it was people like Leary or the people in the CIA, the Army. They all thought it was going to do great things for their own cause or their own purposes. They all thought it was going to be the key to the big breakthrough. And in every instance, it fell short. And I think it was because they all made this mistake, that they ascribed to the drug as if the drug had certain inherent properties, qualities that were actually projections of people's own minds. So the CIA describes and defines the drug in their documents as an anxiety-producing agent. Why? They're total Cold War paranoids, giving the drug to people in these weird settings, and then describe, hey, lo and behold, all it does is create anxiety all the time. And they think, well, it's an anxiety-producing agent. They realize they've just done this, And in the 60s, you had the civil rights movement and this nonviolent pacifism, love one another and so forth and so on, and that was sort of the social ethos. And lo and behold, LSD becomes the love drug. It's this drug that's going to guaranteed enlightenment and so forth and so on. As if in the drug itself was this thing that spelled enlightenment, or that spelled religious experience of necessity. You have to have that. If you take it, it will do this thing. Again, projecting what was in people's own minds onto the drug, or was in the culture. Again, the psychic and the social fabric coming together, projecting it onto the drug. And that's, in some sense, that was the LSD trap that people fell into. Thanks.
That was Martin Lee on the CIA and LSD, Acid Dreams. He spoke in Menlo Park, California. Martin Lee is a noted journalist. He's the author of Acid Dreams. His latest book is The Beast Reawakens. This program is produced by Alternative Radio, an award-winning independent series broadcasting nationally and internationally since 1986. If you'd like to place a Visa or MasterCard order for the program you just heard, Martin Lee on the CIA and LSD, please call the following toll-free number, 1-800-444-1977. Again, that toll-free number for Visa or MasterCard orders is 1-800-444-1977. Our email address is ar@orci.com. Again, email ar@orci.com. Or you can send in your check. Printed transcripts are $9 even. Cassettes are $12 plus $1 for postage. The address, AR, P.O. Box 551, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Again, printed transcripts are $9 even. Cassettes are $12 plus $1 for postage. The address, AR, P.O. Box 551, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Charles Wren recorded the program. I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.